Civilization has issues with the late game. It's not very fun to play. If you weren't aware of this, I'll show you what's going on real quick and get you caught up on where this discourse is coming from. Let's see what the developers of both Civilization 5 and 6 have said on this issue, because I think it's both kind of funny, but it also demonstrates the depth of the problem. When developing Civ 6, a major focus was adding variety and complexity. Part of that was because they didn't feel that there was enough going on in the late game. Dennis Shirk was the producer for Civ 5 and 6. I'm sure you remember way back in Civilization 5, the very base game, the last third of the game wasn't very interesting. It felt like a very empty space, just hitting next turn a lot. So it's kind of the pacing that's always the biggest challenge. But in the post-mortem for Civilization 6, Ed Beach claimed that by the time you get to the late game, there's an awful lot of cities and units and so forth to manage, and we wanted to think about that and come up with a different approach so that we can make the game more manageable, more approachable, and actually just get players to the finish line more often than had been happening with previous Civ games. So, Civ 5 didn't have enough going on in the later half of the game, so they added more things for a player to do in the expansions and in Civilization 6. For example, you can make national parks, do archaeology, make mountain tunnels, and manually build your railroads with no hotkeys. But apparently this also didn't work because by Civ 7, they were trying to fix the late game by stripping things back. And now, we're back to people complaining that there's nothing to do. So what on earth is going on? Why have only 37% of Civ 6 players ever won a game? Why can even the newer Civ games that are well aware that this is an issue not seem to come up with a satisfactory solution? I want to investigate what we would need to tweak to make the late game better in the games that came before Civilization 7. If anything, maybe they weren't broken. Maybe they're broken in a way that cannot be fixed. Let's have a look. To start, how is the late game bad? One of the dev diaries for Civilization 7 summed it up pretty well. There may be additional issues, but these seem to be the ones that are most responsible for informing their design decisions. The first reason is micromanagement. I hope that this is intuitive. The later you are into the game, the more stuff you have to move around. Wars are fought with more units, you have more cities, and the number of civs calling you up asking to trade their world map in exchange for fission has increased, etc. The second issue is snowballing. Advantages gained earlier on are orders of magnitude more important than whatever happens later because of the ripple effect that they create. This has a ton of downstream effects. It messes up civ balance. Late game powers and unique units would need to be crushingly powerful just to match the value of a modest improvement to an early game utility unit. And because we get such monumental leads, closing out the game becomes monotonous. Nothing matters except for your victory condition. Everything else stopped mattering ages ago. Typically, there's not even any need to stop the opponent from pursuing their victory condition. It is extremely rare to see a game that is a race between, say, me building my spaceship and the enemy trying for a domination win. I should take a moment to emphasize that this is different from the ways that other games work. A 7-1 soccer game is basically over. But being up by that many points doesn't magically make it impossible for the opposing team to score a goal on you, which it basically does in Civ. And it basically does in League of Legends too. Winning early makes you snowball hard, and it becomes very difficult for the enemy team to kill you. But there is still tension because if you somehow do throw one team fight, then your lead could just completely evaporate. Not in Civ. Your empire cannot collapse. I mean, maybe in Civ 2 if you forget to build the Statue of Liberty, but otherwise, no. So, you can see that this is not just completely unique to 4X games, but they surely rest on the far end of a sliding scale. The first reason I listed is probably the best area for developers to approach, the micromanagement. Change the game so that later on you make fewer decisions, maybe because you're making them at a bigger scale. So for example, merging units together into armies and corps, like in Civ 6, reduces unit micro. Civ 5's puppet state system meant that you had fewer cities to micromanage if you conquered and built up a big empire. You could also add optional automation, more hotkeys, and quality of life changes like rally points that make big empires faster to manage. These sorts of changes improve the late game, and we should make them wherever we get the chance. But I don't think it's a comprehensive strategy for fixing the late game problem. If you cut back the micromanagement, the best case scenario is that the players hit end turn until the game ends, if they have a clear advantage. And usually, if the human is still playing, it's because they have built up that sort of advantage. So why not do something to interfere with the snowballing? Well, it probably wouldn't have the impact that you want it to. Let me explain why. Snowballing and scaling up is an extremely important source of civilization's appeal. That's why we love wonders so much. Not just because the advantage they give is big, but in most cases because the advantage lasts the rest of the game. That's why one more turn is such a big deal in Civ. The addictive nature of accumulating increasingly large piles of productive capacity is the sugar that makes the medicine of a complex strategy game go down. I think a good point of comparison would be idle games, stuff like Cookie Clicker. They've stripped away almost all of the strategy, and so they have less going on that makes them interesting. Because of this, I don't think anyone would say that they have remotely comparable replay value to Civ, but they do have a similar appeal in their offer of infinite snowballing, and they do it in a way that's a lot more honest and transparent with their audience. Because the core gameplay loop is all about progression and scaling, very few of them have satisfying endings. A lot of them go on forever. That's the point. One idle game that I really liked was Soda Dungeon. It had a feature where, when you cleared the dungeon's final boss, you could move to a different dimension where you keep some of your upgrades, but lose all of your gold and items. I see this as akin to the era changes system from Civilization 7. This is a cool system because you can maintain the focus on scaling, while returning to the stripped-back feeling and reduced complexity of the early game. But you're also chopping the endgame up and distributing the nothing matters of it all throughout the rest of the game, so it ends up being a bit of a side grade. Okay then, well, let's try something else. If the endgame is unfun, why don't we just remove the endgame? For a domination victory in Civ 3, you need 66% of global population and land area. Why not just make that number 50%, or even 40%? Maybe a smaller number if the map is bigger, or if you're playing against more rivals. In Civ 6, you need to control every civilization's original capital. Why not every capital but one? Why not a smaller number of capitals if you're playing on a larger map with more rivals? This would speed up the game, and I think more people would finish games. But you're just moving the late game earlier on. That period of the game where you have a clear path to victory and nothing can stop you has not been removed, it has just been pushed so that it happens 100 years earlier. So it ends up being the same problem as the era system I mentioned earlier. You cannot remove the tedious grind towards victory conditions in a game where leads are this stable that has this sort of snowballing. Instead, you're just moving that tedious grind to different parts of the game. There is more of a chance that this end period is dynamic, because the lead that you've built up isn't quite as big. On average, the game will be more competitive and suspenseful, but that comes at a cost. You experience a shorter game. Instead of the modern era being irrelevant, the industrial era is irrelevant, and you don't even get to play the modern era. Civilization 3's diplomatic victory is an example of this in practice. It lets you get a fast win, but the cost is that 1/3 of the tech tree is irrelevant. High-level players don't even bother building hospitals and factories, not because they're bad, but because the game will be over before the point at which they become good. And that cuts into the infinite power scaling fantasy that so many players enjoy. You can get rid of the endgame, but you cannot get rid of the problems that impending victory conditions create. At least, as long as you have victory conditions. Okay, why don't we just get rid of the victory conditions? Why not just let players just keep scaling into infinity and quit when they get bored? That's how Cookie Clicker works. Plus, Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron 4 also do not have formal victory conditions. Very few people go for the top score when time runs out, or for genuine world conquests. Most people just understand that you set your own goals, and you quit when you're satisfied. Why can't Civ be like that? Well, it definitely could, but Europa Universalis is that way because it has to be. The scale of the game is massive, and the starts are unbalanced. Any victory condition that you set that would be fair for Ming China would be excruciating for Mazovia. There's likely still a way to make it work, but the scale of civilization is more manageable. And so most players instinctively seek the thematic closure of winning a game of Civ, sending that spaceship to Alpha Centauri or dominating the world with their military. To me, that's what it is. People don't try to win Civ just because winning is fun. They go for the win because it fulfills their journey, and it's a satisfying way to end things. Or maybe they don't care about feeling satisfied, they'd rather just have more fun and start another game. But when they have a playthrough that's particularly meaningful or challenging, and they want that closure, the option is there. I would liken it to a credits scene after the final boss of a role-playing game. A cutscene plays where it shows you and your dwarf boyfriend riding off into the sunset. It's essential, you couldn't make the game without providing that resolution. But if you find out that most players are skipping that cutscene, that is completely okay. So, this is my thesis. Adding more content to the late game didn't fix Civ 6. Adding the era system didn't fix the late game of Civ 7. Developers have options, but they do not have solutions. There are a few changes that I think would be unambiguously good, like adding tools for faster empire management, and making victory conditions easier to reach on bigger maps with more rival civs. But the late game will never be as consistently fun as the early game in Civ. That's fine. They don't need to break their backs trying to make it that way. Even with this issue, it is still a fantastic series. I don't know, maybe there's some hidden option that makes everything fall into place. Let me know in the comments if you think there is. I actually think the Distant Lands system from Civ 7 could have functioned in that way by revealing new threats for your hyperscaling nation to deal with. But without larger map sizes, I don't think we're going to see its full potential. That's all for today. Complete tonal shift, but if you want to see a funnier video where I complain about the most unpleasant things that the AI can do to you in Civ, click on the video right here. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Take care, everybody. Cheers.